Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing The Phantom Menace. This film came out in 1999 and it was directed by George Lucas. Those of you who watch me regularly know I've been going back and revisiting Star Wars, and eventually, of course, I had to make it to the prequels, and it's been a weird mix. The whole experience of reviewing these films has been a weird mix of like personal bias and that natural nostalgia, and obviously that more removed analytical critic that I am now. Of course, the original trilogy shaped my life immensely, but I am a millennial, and The Phantom Menace came out when I was 9 years old, and as much as it pains me to say at times, it hugely shaped my life as well. Obviously, now I have a lot of perspective. As a kid, I think I saw the film maybe 60, 70 times, and I've taken a long gap in between. Of course, I look at the original trilogy as this very rebellious sort of thing, a unique experiment, and in some ways it is a fluke, but at the same time it did, of course, change Hollywood in the most dramatic way, and it begins as something original, but once we get to the third film, Return of the Jedi, it's starting to lose a little bit of that originality, and it's kind of tipping more towards, Star Wars becoming this huge industry, as it was, but it's growing bigger and bigger. But by the time we get to Return of the Jedi, I'm starting to see that originality kind of tip more towards more like Star Wars as a big industry, like the franchise obviously being this very lucrative vehicle. But then we fast forward 20 years and George had this idea that, he wanted to make the films as long as he had creative control over them, the prequels. I can understand him wanting to write it. The fact that he wanted to direct it, I'm really not sure I quite understand all of that, especially for somebody who claims they really don't like directing very much, especially something of this size. But, I don't know, George is a very cryptic man. I see this as an example of somebody who's gotten too famous, as somebody who has been told they are a genius too many times, and he surrounds himself with yes men, essentially, people who won't look him in the eye and people who won't challenge his words. And I do like to look at the individual trilogies and how they reflect certainly the time period in which they existed. That's just something that critics tend to do. But yeah, when I look at this film with that perspective, it does certainly carry that feeling, like that feeling of 1999. Original trilogy has this simplicity to it, a clarity and a confidence. It's bold and rebellious, as I've said, but then you get to 1999, and I guess whatever it is about the period, I don't know, it carries this sedentary sort of melancholy mood. Even if this film is not necessarily a commentary on sedentary living, like a lot of really big movies at the time were, like Office Space and Fight Club, The Matrix, etc. But it certainly carries the feeling. It's a reflection of 1999 in a way, just in the sense of like information overload. This film is filled with information and this constant need to explain itself. And it's that sort of thing where it's like, I don't think it needs to be explained. It certainly works well if you don't, but you could if you wanted to, I suppose. When I think of Star Wars, I think of energy and that thrill. I think of lightness. I think of crispness. But when I watch Phantom Menace, I just feel kind of like it feels heavy. I feel like everything's getting bogged down, and it has that stilted mood, robotic, cold. And this is what I mean by the industry of Star Wars getting way too out of hand at this point, in the sense that you have just so many fan theories. There's so many books written about Star Wars at this point. The mythology of Star Wars has been theorized about by all kinds of different nerds all over the world. And I'm willing to bet you that George Lucas doesn't know about 80% of it, and nor does he need to. But my point is everything is bigger than him at this point, and that is a huge problem, because this is naturally supposed to be a departure from the original series, which I appreciate. But it is, like a slow tragedy, a tragedy of Anakin as a hero. And so how do you carve out a singular story that can, that is under 2 hours to kind of reflect the beginning of that? And quite honestly, I'm very into mythology and history about something if I'm interested in it, even if it is something that is fictional for sure. So with something like this, it's like I could see it being good. If if this were handled, if this were executed well, I could see it being a good film. But the majority of the time it's feeling unnecessary. So, naturally it's not paying off as an experience. Now, that being said, watching this film, I did not hate it as much as I thought I was going to. I actually found myself appreciating certain things about it with perspective. I do think that a lot of work went into this, and whether you like it or not, it did inspire a lot of people in that sense. And it certainly inspired me creatively as a child. And yes, whether you like it or not, there is something fascinating about knowing the enormity of the project, or a project like this, and knowing the stakes that are involved, and so many people working on it. And ultimately, as we all know, it's going to fail miserably initially at the time. And I wouldn't say that the film is enjoyable, entertaining in the ways that, I normally like to be entertained, but it is interesting. I like to think about George Lucas and where he was at. Like I said, it's all kind of reflecting a certain time period, because, you look at the original trilogy, George Lucas is this young guy, with all these ideas, and he's fearless. And now You know, he's gotten very, very wealthy and he's living off the fat of the land. And I don't care who you are, you create something like this, the enormity of it, it's probably going to get to your head in some way. And I think, you know, just here, I feel like there's a little bit of overconfidence going on. And I mean that from just like more like a special effects standpoint, from like a technical standpoint, in terms of the ambition, all of that, that's what I mean. But at the same time, he also feels, or he seems very overwhelmed. So it's like, it's really counterintuitive. Putting all your eggs in one basket, I just don't think is really a good thing most of the time. I think the great thing about the original trilogy is that there were limitations. So you had to tame the beast. It's very similar like with Jaws and Steven Spielberg. That shark not working, that giant mechanical shark, is the key to why that film is so brilliant. It was the limitations. George wants everything to be done on a computer to the point where everything is glossy and everything is lacking in any sort of tangibility. Any sort of CGI that is going to be effective for me is going to be a combination of practical effects throughout the film, where the CGI is typically working to serve, you know, a particular purpose. It's serving to make something feel real in a larger sense. It's not just solely CGI. When it's the entire effect, rarely is it ever going to fully work for me. But here we are, we're tipping too far into that CG, and like I said, we've grown too rich, too limitless in terms of what we can do with technology. And this is where the taste levels and the good judgment start to reveal itself. And notoriously, this film is incredibly complicated from a plot standpoint, and we associate Star Wars more with simplicity and, you know, being a kid and all of that, but now it feels like nothing is clear, and yeah, it's just fully the opposite direction. Everything is messy and disorienting. There's really no clear protagonist, no clear direction where we're going, and often the character motivations don't make sense. Certain things don't add up. There's just a lot of sloppiness, unnecessarily sloppy, and I find myself really baffled that I have this many questions in a film this big that is supposed to be so mainstream. It's like, you know, how exactly is all this working? How is Palpatine able to manipulate the Trade Federation in the way that he does? And how is he setting it up when obviously there are going to be potential wild cards with, you know, the signing of this treaty and such? So, you know, like, it's bogged down with all this information, but yet I have even more questions, and so there's no clarity. And I will be honest with you, in terms of the characters, this is something that I wasn't expecting returning to it. There are a lot of annoying characters here, or characters that really puzzle me, but Qui-Gon Jinn, fuck that dude. Seriously. He prides himself on being like this mindful Jedi who like meditates mid lightsaber battle and all this, but no, I think he's a liar. I think he's a manipulator, and he risks the fate of people that are close to him based on, you know, very little information, based on a hunch. I like that they have Padme constantly questioning him in this film, especially, you know, when they're on Tatooine and such, and I'm like, yes, yes, good girl. Now, naturally, she's the queen, so it makes sense that she would ask those things, but he doesn't know that yet. When she tells him he assumes too much, I'm like, oh, understatement of the year. But Qui-Gon goes to Tatooine, he finds this boy, and the Force is unusually strong with him to such a degree that Qui-Gon is, you know, really, really impressed. And so he decides to, you know, like make a bet with the kid's owner so he can have his freedom. The kid has a mother as well, but yet he barely lifts a finger to try and help her. And I love, you know, when he actually does end up getting free, he's like, I tried to free your mother, Annie. And I'm like, when? I saw you put up maybe half a second of a fight and then you manipulated the game. Fuck you, man. Then he takes the kid to Coruscant to the Jedi Council, and he's arguing with the Jedi in front of this boy about his future, and that is just so inappropriate. Oh, and he also throws his own Padawan under the bus, Obi-Wan, and he's just like, oh, I'll train Anakin. Oh, forget about Obi-Wan. He's fine. He's ready to face the trials. It's like, whoa, did you guys discuss this beforehand? It doesn't look like it. And then later on, Obi-Wan goes up to him and apologizes to him. For what? For being honest with his master, for being stubborn and having a one-track mind that, you know, everybody else can see could be potentially dangerous? I don't know, I'm just baffled. I blame the fall of the Republic on Qui-Gon, basically. I just think he's a piece of shit. And also, I hate at the end when he is on his deathbed and he basically guilt drips Obi-Wan into basically training the next Hitler. And then there's Jar Jar, and he is, he's as bad as I thought he would be. I know he was meant to kind of have a Looney Tunes type of energy, maybe like Goofy or something, but it's just not working. I think it's just, everything is off the mark in terms of the animation, in terms of the performance, the comedic timing, all of it. He just feels like a major distraction in the film. And maybe if the Darth Jar Jar theories ever took shape, then there would be something to it, but alas. As a kid though, and I think like a lot of kids, I thought Jar Jar was hilarious. So, you know, George is clearly on to something. He knows his demographic. But man, as I said before, George is just a really awkward director, and like I said, it's like He often says he really doesn't love directing, at least, directing big films of this nature, and I kind of get conflicting answers from him a lot. And if that is true, then Phantom Menace, I think, is a major indication of that. There are just way too many long shots in the film, too many awkward silences and beats, and just the editing is really strange. The transitions themselves are awkward, and obviously the storytelling is incredibly unfocused. It's kind of like an ice cream cake where it's like really beautifully decorated, but it is melting very quickly, and it's like we're trying to keep it in its shape, and it's just blah. And I will say, this did remind me of the original Star Wars in some ways, in terms of the awkwardness of the directing, the lack of cinematic maturity maybe. Because in A New Hope, I think that does exist a little bit, just, it's in a much more organized way. The original Star Wars is incredibly organized, but I do get that essence for sure. And suddenly things start to make sense, and you realize, especially after watching something like The Empire Strikes Back, it's like, oh yeah, there's no way that George Lucas could have, directed a film this brilliant. And I'm certainly very glad that he didn't. Having said all of that, I unapologetically love George Lucas, and I don't know, I just love his personality as a person. He has a very dry, very kind of wicked sense of humor, and I like that he can make fun of himself. I don't think, or I should say, I think he's more self-aware than people give him credit. And there is something really funny about him writing these types of movies, because the dialogue is just so ridiculous. It is so wooden, but I have to admit, as terrible as it is in this film, it's weirdly, fascinating and also kind of entertaining. When I look at the original trilogy, of course, the writing had a lot of charm and it's clever and the characters are likable. And this, by contrast, feels really flat and really, awkward, as I've said. But I don't know, this film reminds me a little bit more of like the biblical epics, the Technicolor films of like the 1950s, whereas, obviously the original series makes you think more of Flash Gordon. And I guess with Phantom, it's the flatness of everything. A lot of those wide shots and the sets and the costumes, the grandiosity of it all, and the choice to build stories more around set pieces rather than vice versa, and just the really schmaltzy, very stilted dialogue. It has a quality that is very nostalgic, and I don't know, something about it I found myself kind of enjoying. But talking about the biblical epic, I think, like the Podrace is a really, really great example of that CinemaScope era from like the 50s and the 60s. It's absolutely going for that chariot race, a lot like Ben-Hur, and obviously, like he wants John Williams to write the Flag Parade March, and obviously he's telling him, just go for Ben-Hur, go for that Miklos Rosa energy. I think this is the best sequence in the entire film, and what I really like about it is that they take the time to build the sequence properly, even if that setup might be faulty, silly, whatever, but the stakes are made fairly clear here. And the race itself, it is just full of really, really spectacular shots, and I think the sound effects in it are absolutely amazing, particularly the sound effects of the racer, of like Anakin and Sebulba. It feels so Star Wars, and it has a lot of variety going on in this sequence, and obviously they're taking laps because it is a race, but they keep it interesting. Yeah, some of it is, as I said, far-fetched and silly, but it moves well. They put a ton of effort into this, and I just really like it overall. I could have totally done without the commentators, and again, it's just the taste levels. There's always just goofy, very strange tonal choices going on here from George, but other than that, I think there's a lot of good stuff happening there. And just aesthetically, all the way around, there's a lot of variety in the film and in these sequences. Each world does feel very unique and very distinct. And a lot of the new elements do, as I said, they feel like Star Wars, and yet there is this choice to go in a very different direction. You're not seeing a whole bunch of regurgitated creature designs, half-assed designs that were done better in the original. And the same with the world designs. They are new, and I really admire them for that. And I think one thing that I really admire maybe the most about this trilogy, and I think a lot of people are starting to give credit where credit is due, especially after the new trilogy came out, but I appreciate the way that they handle fan service. The film is not constantly winking and nudging you, taking you out of the experience just for some sort of nostalgic shout out. This is handled really well. Any of these references, for the most part, not always, but a lot of the time, I do think they're actually cleverly implemented. They're not always drawing attention to themselves just for the sake of being nostalgic, and they actually make sense in the world. They serve a function. Sure, characters like C-3PO and R2, I think, are kind of shoehorned into things, and it does feel kind of silly and not very realistic, but I don't know, overall, I just think this film really tries to be an individual work, and it is very distinct from its predecessors. And there's just a confidence there that I really, really wish that the new trilogy certainly had, but just all kinds of big franchises today, frankly, I wish that they could do that. But yes, the film is a mixed bag of all kinds of weird emotions. Sure, it is stuffy, it is confusing, it's very, very frustrating. At other times you do get that excitement, that feel of Star Wars, but you just don't have the thrill and the childlike excitement like you did in the original trilogy. I feel like too much of the innocence is lost by this point. When I watch a film like The Empire Strikes Back, I had all this excitement afterwards, and I just had an extra pep in my step. But when I watch this film, I just feel kind of tired afterwards. And, you know, like the 90s era is just taking a lot of that simplicity from the original trilogy and trying to interpret it in ways that kind of allow a lot more of the reality to set in. And what I mean by that is the reality of the industry itself is starting to set in, and Star Wars is no longer innocent. It's in a midlife crisis of sorts. I understand why the reaction to it was very strong 20 years ago because of what had come before it. I don't think I'm going to be returning to this film anytime soon at all, but yeah, I am glad that I watched it, and I'm still enjoying reviewing all the different Star Wars films. But that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website, as always, is deepfocuslens.com. I'm an artist. I do commission portraits, and I also sell prints of my work. If that is something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below, and if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons who are wonderful. Thank you guys so much for your support. Welcome to all the new members. If you are interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.